Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Friday Reporter podcast. Today's episode is super timely and one that I think you're going to find that allows you to talk about politics and elections in a way that doesn't cause you to have to break up with your family or your friends. Today's guest is Katie Cochran, who is the host of This Election podcast. Katie, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell me and the listener that's tuned in today about this election and how you came to come up with the concept.
Yeah, great. This past winter, I was thinking about how I wanted to engage in this election, and I noticed something really interesting. Heart started to race.
Mhm.
I got a little nauseous, and I had this really tight constriction in my chest. And I thought, gosh, I know these sensations.
Mm-hmm.
And I know them because prior to moving to DC, I ran a homeless shelter in Florida for families and women experiencing homelessness. And those were the sensations I would feel when I was going to the shelter for the most intense moments. So the overdoses or the mental health crises or the fights. It was my trauma response. And it was like, this is crazy, right? And having a trauma response to thinking about working for a candidate I like
Yes.
in the political arena. I'd been involved in politics before, and so I thought this is really interesting. And as a social scientist, I also have a background. That's what I did before running the shelter. I was in academia as a political scientist. And so I decided I'm going to go research this. And so I began to do some research into politics and trauma. And I learned three really interesting things. So first was that what I was experiencing is pervasive. So there is a lot of exhaustion and anger and anxiety around politics.
Absolutely.
So there was a 2023 Pew survey that showed that 65% of Americans are exhausted by politics always or most of the time.
Wow.
55% are find themselves angry about politics
Interesting.
always or most of the time. There was a 2019 study done by Kevin Smith and his colleagues at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and it found that 20% of people had reported losing sleep over politics or having their friendships damaged by politics.
That's why I made that joke at the beginning of the episode, because I do know that it really is.
It impacts us a
It
lot.
impacts us. And so what did you take from that yourself having that reaction? Like, at least
Yeah.
you were validated knowing that other people were feeling that same way.
Yes,
But what did you take from that?
exactly. So I saw that this was pervasive. And then the next thing that the research showed me was that politics is inherently triggering. It's triggering because it is related to our core beliefs. And our core beliefs would enable us to navigate the world with safety or make us feel like we can navigate the world. And so when
Interesting.
you're engaged in politics, you're engaged in a debate over what you think society should be. And that engages your core beliefs. And so it's automatically triggering. And that's true for politics all the time in all places.
Yeah.
But our current environment is exacerbates that.
Because it feels even more existential and emotional now. So you did find that this is a sort of a unique time that we're in.
Yes, and it's for two reasons. So one, in addition to having that kind of your safety potentially triggered because of this connection to core beliefs, the parties also tend to dehumanize each other, which means then we're getting messages that threaten our dignity of, am I a good person? And because both of the parties also tend to have this approach that's walk the line or you're out, then there's this ostracization that happens where now our belonging is threatened. So our people are saying if we don't walk the line, we're not part of them. The other side is saying we're a bad person, so our dignity is threatened. So you have all of these threats all at one time.
Yeah.
And that's really triggering. That's going to trigger our fight, flight, freeze responses.
Yes.
Just because we want to keep ourselves safe. We want to maintain our safety. We want to maintain our dignity and our belonging.
Mm-hmm.
This was really revelatory for me for two reasons. One is it just helps understand where we're at and why you see so much of this reactivity in our politics. And that reactivity can look like the anger on the news sometimes.
Yeah.
But it can also look like the pulling back and the numbing that a lot of people feel too. I just can't watch the news anymore.
I do. You hear a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that revelation had this aha moment for me, which was because of my work at the shelter, I know how to work through trauma.
Yeah.
And I know how to do that without disengaging.
Mm-hmm.
And so while people may not necessarily resonate with this idea of a trauma lens to understand our politics, and a lot of the studies maybe frame it as chronic stress or mental health rather than a trauma.
Yes.
Looking through a trauma lens helps us point to a way forward because there's been so much research on healing and resilience. And even if those types of resources weren't developed for politics, they can be used in the political realm.
Then you arrive at the idea or you're probably thinking about how do I then share this
Yeah,
conversation, right?
exactly. And so that's where the podcast came
Oh, I
from. And
love it.
so
I love
I
it.
was like, I need to share this with others because I think it's so revelatory, both in help understanding where we are and in charting a way forward. And the idea for the podcast was born. I decided I wanted to do two things with that. One was interview the researchers and clinicians who can help us better understand where we're at. Because I think the first step in moving forward is understanding why we react the way we do
Hmm.
to politics. And then the other part of the podcast is really who can we look to learn how to remain engaged with hope while caring for
Katie,
ourselves.
this is so cool.
Yeah, so that's what it is. A lot of the guests, so the guests are some of the research I found on, but then most of them are also people that I relied on while I was working at the shelter. So the people whose wisdom and tools and spiritual practices were ones that I went to. I was feeling hopeless, when I was
Yes.
feeling burnt out, when I knew I needed to engage, but every part of my body was saying, this is too much. And so there are
Yeah.
people that let me move through the world with hope, who I also believe can help us move through politics with more
Yeah.
hope and more compassion for each other.
You're like the remedy that we all need right now. And I mean that sincerely, especially in this town, because I think that you're giving some perspective to how we all are feeling and validating those emotions, which is clearly what you did for yourself.
Yeah,
So you mentioned before you have a background in sociology, is
and
that
political
right?
science.
Political, you have a background in political science. But then the intersection between political science and then your experience in the community
Mhm.
at the shelter that you worked at in Florida, that's like revelatory to me.
Yeah.
So I know that the conversations, I cannot wait to get into it. It's a finite series though, is that right?
Yeah, so the idea was this is the way I really wanted to engage this election. I'm doing other things as well, but I really wanted to offer a set of conversations that listeners could use for this election cycle. And so we launched right after Labor Day. We're going to go through the election. And one of the really exciting things is that paired with every conversation is a practice, is something, a tool or a resource that you can take with you
Oh, wow. That's
as
awesome.
you listen to debates or have conversations with your family, see area, go about your work. And there's the conversation I had with Marby Corbett comes along with a workbook that you can use to understand kind of the connection between your beliefs
Wow.
and your political commitments. There is a playlist from a musician that I interviewed. We talk about kind of music as a portal to empathy. There's meditations. There's all sorts of different resources that are paired with each conversation so that you can listen to the conversation and hopefully have it kind of motivate and ground you. But then when you find yourself in the midst of politics and you're like, I need to come back to me, or I know I'm going to go into an area that's really charged and I need to get ready for that so I can show up
Oh,
as a grounded
that's
version of
fantastic.
myself.
Yes.
That's there. And so that's here for the offering for everyone as they
That
age.
is, it's like I said, it's what we need right now. This is a bit of a family affair too, if I'm not, I hope to not reveal that. But what I love about the way that you've come to this conversation and building the podcast by engaging your own son to compose the music for the show. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you called on your sister who also has like a background in, she has a psychology background.
Yes.
And so the conversations themselves are really not only curated, but also really intensely personal in a good way. I
Yeah.
love that about how you've thought about it too.
They are really personal, and I'm so proud of the music that Ian created for it. Beautiful, y'all.
Yeah.
But even the conversation with Marby, I started having this conversation with her 8 years ago. It's 2016, right? Like, I started being like,
Right.
"How do I grapple with what is happening in our country?"
Right.
And she helped me through that, and it's interesting, though, because I feel like all of the conversations have this level of kind of personal connection because even the people who I didn't know before I interviewed them, I knew them deeply because I was reading their books. I was listening to
Absolutely.
them. I feel like there are
Yes.
people that accompanied me through the challenges of keeping a shelter open in the pandemic. And
Oh, yeah,
so
I know.
there's this intimacy there that they've been willing to enter into. They've entered into it with so much generosity. And some of them have worked explicitly in politics, but many of them haven't. And it's this willingness to say, what gifts can I bring to this realm to help heal our country? And it's so inspiring to be a part of.
Yeah. And it's right now. We need now more than ever, but also too, it's about what's happening today, but also how we move the needle in a way that we're able to engage in dialogue beyond November, right? And
Yes.
beyond that. So, as much as it's a finite series, it's a conversation that will live in infamy online that people can continue to draw from. Having those resources, though, Katie, I think are so incredibly important because you're right. We engage in the supermarket, we engage in a professional environment, we engage in our school commitments with our children. It's everywhere. And it's not just because it's Washington, D.C. In fact, if anything, it's one of the things I talk about here on the show is that our news media, because it has shrunk so much in the local community, people draw so much of their information from national
Mhm.
platforms that has really made this less about Washington, D.C. and more about the country in general. Some people might say, oh, I really love to meditate. And some
Mhm.
people might say, I can't really find the time to do it. It's not something that is a priority for me.
Mhm.
So through music and through
Mhm.
other sort of means, you're really offering everybody, it's really a serving of what just about anybody can find and use in their own way of transcending this.
Yes, so much. And it's definitely something that I hope is a resource for the very, very engaged people. Again, one of the things that came out of the research was that those who are most engaged are also most taxed. So they are the
Mhm.
ones that are the most exhausted, that tend to be the most triggered. And that's because a lot of the tools we would normally use to help regulate our emotions also lead to political disengagement. And so
Mhm.
there's this kind of flip side. And so the people in DC and the people in towns everywhere that are deeply engaged are feeling this the most. And so this is for them, but it's also for people who are like, I don't need to be involved in all of that. My guest in a few weeks is Parker Palmer, and he talks about the pre political activities we do, just the ways in which we form public spaces with each other on streets, in schools, and libraries, and all the
Yeah.
places where we form community and we create
Mhm.
space to bring our differences and enable them to rise up in creative ways.
Yeah.
That work is really important too, and all of that is gonna continue past the election. The conversations and the resources, while they've been designed knowing that we were all gonna be under a lot of stress from September through November,
Mhm.
they're also meant to live beyond this as we continue. This is a long-term project in terms of changing our political culture.
Do you find that the project gave you more hope that we can transcend this? Okay.
100%. I leave all of the conversations, like, almost giddy, like, effervescent, right? Because I feel like it's concrete tools I can use now that I'm like,
Mhm.
"I can't wait to go have a conversation," or, "I can't wait to try this before the debate," or whatever it is. But I also there's this groundedness of there is a way forward, and there are many people who desire this and are willing to lean into what's needed to make this happen.
Absolutely. Yes, so much. And I love that about all of what you've built. Tell me, if you will, you and I have talked previously to this conversation about how you yourself are a family, a military family, and how a lot of times you actually part of the culture, the way that your family moves quite a
Yeah.
bit. And so you don't actually have the benefit of being in a community for a extended period of time. So every time you change your location, you are probably having to go through some of these processes again and again. So this also is a tool for people who don't necessarily have a home base that is a permanent home base.
Yes, because we can. So I'm part of a military family. I'm a military spouse. I also grew up in the military, so I was a military brat. And
Mm.
if people ever ask me where I'm from, right now I'm from
Yeah,
Arlington is one answer. And then sometimes my answer is, well, I'm just from America, like from all the places, you know?
absolutely. Yes.
Home and community is where we show up and
Hmm.
where we live, right?
Hmm.
And so that can be, you may feel at home where you live right now, but you also may not. And I think as we think about how do we engage in these spaces and how do we make places feel like home, it's about connecting with the people around us, the ones who think the same as us and the ones who don't, and figure out what do we share in common? What do you care about? What motivates you to be in this space and finding those commonalities before any of the politics gets brought up so that when politics does, you're already connected. You already
Yeah.
see the good in them.
Mm.
I've been so lucky to move around for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons that I really appreciate that I think has informed this project a lot is I have been in places where I am the political minority, where hardly anyone thinks the way that I think.
Sure.
And I've been in places where everybody thinks the way I think. And it's
Yes.
so I've experienced both of those. And they both have their own challenges, right? And
Mhm.
but it also, what it shows me, and this is one of the commitments of the show is to really honor the humanity of all of us, which means there's good in all of us and all of us make mistakes. And we need to repair and we need to move past that. And those who you agree with are not perfect. And those who you disagree with have wonderful goodness in them. We're all just messy, right? And
Yeah.
I think the more we can enter into these public spaces and be willing to be in the messiness and the goodness of that, the more I think then we can bring some of that practice into the way we engage politically when politics comes up.
I love that. I think that's so right because we do find ourselves in these environments where we can be in the minority in our point of view. We can be surrounded by our friends. But I think the value in being open to all of those kinds of perspectives is that we can find the commonality and have conversations. I've definitely been in spaces with my own family where I've said, you feel as if the direction is going to head down a pathway that might not be good. I myself have said, I'd like to stay on good standing with you. So why don't we just not do that today?
Yes.
A lot of times, as you being a military family, I being someone who's spent a lot of time in the political point of view, I find people that are outside of where I am want to engage with me. And I actually prefer to say, let's talk about something else. I have another idea and bring other ideas with me as I arrive on the
Mhm.
scene so that we can turn the conversation to food or sports or something that's a little more neutral that doesn't get people to a place where they can no longer spend time together.
There may be times where you are ready to engage
Right.
and where you're in a place where you can have a debate and maintain a relationship, even if there's tension.
Mm.
And there may be days where that doesn't feel like that's doable and you do need to connect to those other things. And so I think both are really important and being intentional about when you're entering those spaces and when you're not entering those spaces and being sensitive to how the people around you are too. Just loved talking politics. And at the beer garden, at wherever, I'd be like, what do you then for me, it was just this interesting, fun thing, regardless of whether the person agreed with me or not. So I just loved debate.
Yes.
But it feels a little less safe to do that. And also, that's not fair because that might be something the other person doesn't feel comfortable with. So kudos to you for sometimes being like, hey, I'd rather talk about this. So I think knowing what we're comfortable with and setting that boundary and honoring that is as important as we're entering those spaces. Just checking out, he will be like, "Are you down to talk about this? If not, that's
Yes.
totally fine, but I'd love to hear your perspective."
Yeah.
So,
Oh, I love that. I think that's a really nice way to come to the conversation too. Ask permission before you headstrong get into it. Outside of the podcast, what other, because you are always cooking up new ideas from our short
yes.
conversation. I know that you're always thinking of what comes next. Right now, it's about delivering this amazing show and this
Yes.
amazing offering to people. Has it sparked any other ideas about things you might like to try after this beautiful project has
Mm.
been fully delivered? The answer can be not yet, or you're not ready to
Yeah,
share.
I think I have suspended a lot in order to make this happen because
Yes.
I realized this in February of this year, and like I had to learn how to make a podcast because I
Yes.
learned how to do this.
Right.
And that's something I believe in so strongly. And so I wanted to really bring the best. I've had so many amazing people say yes to coming on the show that I felt I needed to honor them by
Sure.
really making sure that this was it.
Sure.
I think what comes next, one is a little bit of what you said, which is that this was an offering that was meant for the election, but it maybe needed beyond this. And so what
Absolutely.
might that look like? So I'm just beginning to brainstorm there.
Mhm.
I also think that this intersection of trauma and grace is something that pulls me in a little bit of like, where are the areas where there are hard things, where there are wounds that have happened, where there's healing that needs to happen, that we can bring in grace and within the policy political sphere? Because I think it happens also in specific workplaces and areas of how can I begin to bring this wisdom to other places? I learned at a shelter, there's so much application to politics. Where else does that apply? And I
Absolutely.
don't know where that will take me. That's a little bit of what I've been thinking
Well,
about.
keep up the awesome work because I suspect that there'll be more really remarkable things to come, but the show has just gotten started.
Yeah.
In the show notes for the listener, you'll find the link to this election,
Mhm.
which is thiselection.org. They will also be able to find you on all of the platforms that folks listen to podcasts.
Yes.
And let's just make sure that we get the word out because this, I think, is something that you're really all needing. This conversation is something we're really all needing.
Yes, thank you so much. I'd also like to highlight if you go to our website, theselection.org/spiritual practices, that's where all those resources are. That has
Great.
the meditations and the playlists and the movement practices and all of that. And so if there's a time where you're like, I can't quite listen to the podcast, but I need something, go there and just see what speaks to you. So I think that is a great resource.
The hardest question I always ask for the show, and it's what sort of keeps the conversation going, is there someone, perhaps in the conversations that you've had for your show, or someone else in the outside sphere that you think would make a good podcast guest for me in the future?
So I think that Stacey Haynes would be a wonderful guest. She was episode 4, and she has just done so much at this intersection of politics and trauma. And hers is actually a flip where it's how do we the need for healing to include not just healing ourselves, but also healing the social conditions that contributed to what has
Love that.
happened to us.
Mm.
And she's just put so much thought. She has incredible resources and is building an incredible community. And so I think it's something that your listeners would really benefit from hearing her knowledge.
Well,
And
we're
I
going to
think,
listen to your conversation with
yes.
her. And then we're going to build a list of great questions that we have to follow on to the conversation you had. Katie, this was a tremendous thrill. Thank you so much. Congratulations with this election.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for getting me excited.